Hello there and welcome to not the suffragettes as previously advertised, but the rise of Labour. The standard caveated disclaimer applies. This is only for analytical purposes. This will not have the specific information. You must research specific information to illustrate these points. We are looking at this question, which is actually two questions they could ask in the exam. Number one, what is the main reason for the rise of the Labour Party? Which can look at, usually it'll be from 1900 to 1918, but it might just go up to 1914. So we're focusing on up until 1914. We'll do after 1914 in a different lesson. The other question can be is how successful was the Labour Party between 1900 and 1914, and it'll be leading you into saying as a failure. So essentially a bit of background. We've seen this diagram before. I like the diagram because it's pictory. Essentially, as you can see, the story of British politics in this period is one of slow and steady growth from around 1900 until the 1920s, where it becomes and displaces the Liberals as the natural second party of government, and the Liberals are therefore crushed. So the stuff we go through today can also be part of a paragraph explaining why the Liberals decline. It's basically the rise of Labour thesis. So, background into Labour Party. We will be using different names, different nomenclature at different times. It is not the Labour Party until 1906, and in reality it is not a party with a constitution and actually being a political party until 1918. It is the LRC in 1900, the Labour Representation Committee, a loose-knit group of random different socialists who do not agree in any way, shape or form with each other over many issues, but feel like being united is probably better than being divided. But naturally they are all suspicious of each other, unwilling to make much change or agree to much radical things, simply because they don't trust that the other people are going to try and produce a different type of socialism to the one that they want. In 1906, they get into Parliament and they need to look like a respectable party, so they rename themselves the Labour Party. Now, in reality, although it's a little bit less divided because a couple of factions have been forced out, such as the Social Democratic Federation, in reality it is still a hodgepodge of different groups, and it's like a herd of cats getting them organised. It is only until 1918, and we'll look into that in a little bit more detail in a future lesson, that the Labour Party becomes a relatively centralised, relatively organised force. So when we are looking at Labour Party, it's very important to know who these different factions are, because the source questions really focus on this. You are going to read criticisms from one faction or the other. And if you can identify, oh, this is someone clearly from the Independent Labour Party, therefore having this position, you are going to get higher marks than if you just say, well, it's good because this is someone from Labour saying a bad thing about Labour, so it must be true. Okay. Additionally, you cannot make a judgment of success without trying to decide which group within Labour is being successful. If we say the Labour Party is bad because it doesn't reach socialism, as we can see, Ramsay MacDonald and his faction don't want socialism really, and so is it a failure if under his leadership it doesn't become socialist? That's kind of his success, surely. So what we're going to do is a brief tour around the Labour Party and the different groups. Essentially, the British Socialist Party is not a revolutionary force. It is, even on its left wing, dominated with people who perhaps like the rhetoric of revolution, but do not agitate for any real revolution, do not plan by revolution. Violence is not seen as a means in which to achieve political change. And so there is only one real revolutionary force and group, and that's the SDF, the Social Democratic Federation, who will be forced out, or as they say it, they all want to leave in 1903 under Heinzmann. And they advocate actually everything that you would imagine with a socialist party. They are the closest to Marx. They advocate revolution. They advocate relatively militant lines. They advocate using strikes as vectors in order to start a revolution. They argue infiltrating unions to make them more radical. But ultimately, This being British socialism, it's full of middle class people who like the ideas, but actually don't really spend much time with working class people. And therefore, though they are revolutionary, they are all talk. And in reality, because they don't have very good connections of anyone working class, and in fact they disdain at the working class to some extent, and they are intellectuals in private drawing rooms in Bloomsbury, comfortable in living a comfortable middle class existence. In reality, they don't really pose much of a threat, and they do not really represent much power within the party. So they are very easily kicked out / sidelined by Ramsay MacDonald. But there are a revolutionary force, and you might have members of the Social Democratic Foundation as part of a source, so keep an eye out for that. The next level of left-wingness is socialist, but not revolutionary. And this is gradualism. Gradualism is the idea that socialism can be achieved, but it's not desirable to do it in a revolutionary way. Violence is bad, violence will lead to counter-violence, violence will lead to Bonapartism, which is when someone takes over. Different arguments for different reasons, but they all agree that violence and revolution is not good. Rather, it's good to get control as a party of government through a democratically elected and capitalistic system, and then you will slowly change society to make it more socialist, and in the end you'll make it socialist. Now, that's never happened, and you can argue if that's possible or not, but that's not really the focus of this question. You just need to understand that these are revolutionaries, but not revolutionary, if that makes sense. They're trying to bring socialism, but not through violence. And so there's a lot of rhetoric with these men. There's a lot of ideas of betrayal of socialism, but they themselves do not advocate revolution. They have this very weird relationship of lots of talk, therefore, but not much real sense of what the actual parties need to be doing better, what the rest of the moderates need to be doing better. And this is the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, the Scottish, traditional candidates who sort of stood on their own, such as Keir Hardie, and there's a couple of others that you'll see when you do your research, the Cooperative Party, which still actually exists to some extent, and some small groups of intellectuals, etc., spotted about. These are arguably the moral force of the Socialist Party. Labour was originally founded by these people. The moderates came in relatively late, or came from a slightly more centrist position. So they always have this feeling that they are the true Labour Party, echoes perhaps of what's happening today. But in reality, the control of the party rests with the moderates, the centrists, the centre-left. Okay, and these are again another mixed group of individuals, and as you can see, we have so many different factions in the Labour Party now. I've not even mentioned them all, and they are all, so the LRC, and they are all technically have equal vote, although as we shall see, that's not really true. They have the Fabians, who are, in theory, following Fabian tactics, which is getting socialism through gradualism, but they are even more gradualist than the gradualists on the left. They have never really produced a plan about how or why you get socialism, and they are very, very dismissive and sort of ever so slightly smug about their working class. They're a very, very middle-class institution in this period. You have the Lib Labs, for example, people like Henry Broadhurst, who ran as a Liberal, then ran as a Labour Party member, and helps keep a bridge between the two parties, and very often runs or is known as running on both platforms. Then you have the party organisers, people who are actually part of the party hierarchy, such as Ramsay MacDonald, and usually loyal to Ramsay MacDonald. And finally, you have the trade unions. Now, and we will see about the rise of it in a little bit, but the Taft Fayol case really persuades the unions, as we mentioned before, that they need to get involved with politics a lot more, and then leads them to increasingly be sympathetic to the Labour Party. People have been talking about unions getting involved in politics since the 1840s, 1850s, but they have never really bothered because it's seen as too much effort, it's a world they don't understand, and then also they can get enough change through one-on-one negotiations with businesses rather than going through government. Taft Fayol proves to them that they need to have someone in government, and therefore they start supporting British socialism. In theory, okay, the Centre Party is very small. They don't have as many mass support either, except trade unions arguably have much more power. The TUC, the Trade Union Congress, the trade union or trade unions essentially, has in theory 2 million members they can bring to support the Labour Party. Now, in reality, that's not the case. Many of the unions don't support the Labour Party. Many of the members in the unions don't support the Labour Party. But they're essentially, as we shall see, one of the core themes of the British Socialist Party in this period is that it's dominated by the unions. Everyone else, if we look at the groups, everyone else are small, tiny, usually regionally organised groups or individuals. And then you have this mass of trade unions with all the money and lots of people. They have a lot of sway over the party. And therefore, this really explains why British socialism is so different from the continent. British socialism has been described by a trade unionist, in fact, in the 1950s, quite famously, as owing more to Methodism than Marx. The idea that it's primarily a moralistic, gradualist, sort of woolly social democracy than socialism. So British socialism, in reality, because it is dominated by gradualists, even on the left, and because the most powerful group in the LRC are the unions, because they have all the money and they have lots of supporters, and so you kind of got to do what the unions say, it is a very moderate institution. And yes, there's lots of rhetoric. Even Ramsay MacDonald, to prove his loyalty, has to use the word socialism every so often. But in reality, there's very little policies which move towards socialism. Okay? And you can argue that actually there is no one true British socialism. The IRLP have its version of socialism and what they want to happen. The Fabians have theirs, Ramsay MacDonald has theirs, his, and the unions have theirs. But all these different groups have different opinions, but not all these different groups are equal in power. So while for the SDF, socialism is revolution, class struggle, destruction of the bourgeoisie, very sort of traditional socialism. For the ILP, it's class struggle, but not too much violence, and we'll get our moral force to force us through. The Fabians are gradual education of workers, and then there'll be natural socialism. Everyone's got their own ideas. But in reality, if you have the power over the party, your version of socialism becomes the party's version of socialism. And what happens is, because the trade union produces the money and the members, i.e. lots of supporters, lots of organisations, they can guarantee MPs in the constituencies they control, and Ramsay MacDonald is a very good operator at running the show and being a public figure. They dominate the party. And because they dominate the party, their ideas of what socialism should be become the official Labour positions of what socialism should be. i.e., Labour is definitely a left-wing organisation committed to social reform, collective reforms, even greater than that of the New Liberals, but is not aiming for socialism, is not aiming to end capitalism, is not aiming towards true socialist republic in any way, shape or form. They care about working conditions, pay and welfare. They don't care about Marx and revolution. And so therefore the Labour Party has been described in this era as more social democratic than socialist, i.e. you will achieve as much equality as possible through a democratic and social and capitalistic system. Now you can argue that actually is that true? It's definitely true of Attlee in 1945. Is this true in this period when actually, because the party is still so divided, and because the party still doesn't have an official party position, it's got lots of little factions also having their own position, it's difficult to say the Labour Party equals social democratic. It is more fair to say the leadership of the Labour Party equals social democratic. The base of the Labour Party is all a rainbow kaleidoscope of random socialist ideas. But because the leadership has the power, they kind of push a socialist, social democratic line. So therefore, British socialism is far more focused on conditions, wages and role of the state, and keeping to capitalism and keeping to democracy, than getting revolution. Even though there is lots of rhetoric on the left, okay, so if we go back, a lot of rhetoric on the left amongst the ILP, Keir Hardie, Cooperative Party and all these different groups, they don't really mean it. They say it in order to show that they are different and probably more true socialists than Ramsay MacDonald, who's sometimes seen even in this era as a class traitor. And even though there are some isolated smattings of rhetoric of true revolution amongst the SDF, they're kicked out really early, and even then they're like a tiny force which don't really matter and have no real power. So in reality, British socialism is a fundamentally moderate ideology. They want change. At the time, the change they want is actually still quite radical, but it is not socialism. It is social democracy with a herd of cats underneath. So, if this is the case, what is the main reason behind their rise? Now, the biggest reason behind the rise of the Labour Party, or the LRC, is the trade unions. Before the trade unions bother to get interested in politics, the Labour Party is a collection of random groups, all of which distrust each other, all of which have joined up for temporary short-term convenience, not because they believe they want to be united. And because each group is as weak as each other, there's no one to force them to come together. What the trade unions do is they bring the money, the organisation, the MPs, the members, and also the power and control you need to make a party grow. So why do the trade unions, therefore, decide to make the Labour Party rise? Because people have been talking about making a left-wing socialist party since the 1840s, 50s in theory, but truly socialist in the 1870s onwards. Why does this happen? Essentially, trade unionism had spent the 1860s, after a bumpy start, up until the 1890s, slowly growing in power, slowly getting more and more what they want, slowly getting more and more legal recognition. And so they got very comfortable in the idea that this was inevitable, they were growing and they were always going to grow. And because they're always growing in power and influence, and therefore they will get more changes for their members, they don't need to bother with politics. However, in the 1890s, for a number of reasons, but essentially because of a very hostile government to unionism, the trade unions come under a lot of threats. Taft-Fayol decision, as we mentioned, the Osborne judgment, as we mentioned as well, slightly later on, all limit the ability of the unions to strike. Employers start organising and employing federations, and therefore sharing around workers and keeping lists of trade unionists who no one's going to employ, in order to reduce the power of trade unions. They start using blackleg labour, that is people who, when you're on strike, you just bring in extra people, blackleg labour, to do the work. If you're on strike, you're making no money, but the business is carrying on selling stuff because they've got different people to run the show, you are going to lose that strike. And therefore we see a massive rise in strikes and lockouts and problems in labour and in the trade union field, and it's very clear to them, particularly after Taft-Fayol, that if they want change, they cannot just rely on it happening naturally. The government is quite clearly helping the employers through court decisions and also helping them organise Taft-Fayol. Organise the employee federations. If you want to balance against them, then what you have to do is you have to make sure you have your own representation in Parliament. As well as this, unionism in the 1850s has been very artisan-based, i.e. as the engineers, the boilermakers, the skilled upper working class, the far more liberal and less socialist types, okay, the conservative working class, essentially. And therefore unions were naturally more liberal. So while unions existed, they all kind of supported the liberals. As time went on, unions became more mass, low-skilled organisations. The miners got their union, London dock workers got their union. And because of this, they did not naturally fit with the liberals, who were a little bit too conservative for them. And so naturally they start looking around and they start being sympathetic to the idea that perhaps they need a more left-wing party which will match their ideas. As well as this, their trade unions became under control of people like Thomas Mann, who were less liberal in their orientation, less supportive of the Liberal Party, who they saw as the same problem as the bosses, less or less too laissez-faire, and therefore they start accepting and negotiating around the idea of having a political party. So on the 27th of February, the LRC is set up as a result of all these pressures. Now, there are on the LRC committee 2 SDF, 2 ILP, 1 Fabian and 7 trade unions, with Ramsay MacDonald as the secretary. What you will immediately notice is if you are going to run, okay, a party, you have got on the first 3 groups an incredibly socialist, a kind of gradualist, and a basically centrist group, the SDF, the ILP and the Fabians, who will never agree with each other anyway. And then they represent 5 votes. The trade unions represent 7 votes. So if the trade unions want something, it will happen. And there's no way, shape or form about that. There's no way that even if they, for some magic miracle, all the SDF, ILP and Fabians all agree with each other, despite the fact they naturally hate each other, they still won't outvote the trade unions. This is an organisation controlled by trade unions. And that's very, very key to remember. Even despite that, though, even before the Taffel judgment, there was only 41 unions, which is quite small, as part of the Labour Party. The rest had not been convinced that it was necessary, because if you join the Labour Party, you kind of have to give some money to the Labour Party, and not everyone was convinced they wanted to do that. They were still clinging on to the idea that they could be independent. So they only had 353 affiliated members. Now already that's more than all the other groups in the Labour Party put together, but that's not that much. After the Taffel judgment, which is just slightly after the foundation of the LRC, 127 unions with 500,000 members in a few years became affiliated and joined the party. This provides £5,000 in funds as a result, which enables the MPs to be paid, and they pay for a national office and organise a party. So as we can see, it's the unions increasingly engaging with the idea of basically coming into this herd of cats and turning it to their own purpose, who provide the numbers, the money and the control. So the rise of trade unionism and the politicisation of trade unionism is absolutely key for the rise of the Labour Party, and in turn explains why they're so conservative, or at least relatively conservative. As well as this, we've already mentioned how the Lib Lab Pact gives the Labour Party just over 30 MPs, which once you have people in Parliament and you show that you are responsible, that you are mature, that you can be trusted with government positions, leads to people increasingly viewing the Labour Party as actually they are not a group of random cranks and socialists. They are a legitimate party. As soon as people think they are a legitimate party, they will entertain the idea of voting for them. So what the Lib Lab Pact does is it gives that core nucleus, that small group of MPs that who can then prove themselves to the public that Labour can be trusted, which means in future elections people will be happier to vote for the Labour Party. As well as this, you must emphasise the role of MacDonald. MacDonald is absolutely key for the Labour Party. Now, this is obviously a very controversial point, considering what he does later, but without MacDonald, you would not have a Labour Party. Essentially, MacDonald is a genius at uniting the various different factions. He basically plays them off against each other and makes them concerned that everyone else is backstabbing them, and therefore they want to not annoy MacDonald, because then they might be kicked out of the LRC, and then they turn backstab each other, which then gives the impression that they're backstabbing each other. Essentially, he manages to combine them, bounce them off against each other, and not allow them to unite. He divides and rules. He also fundamentally has a very good working relationship with the trade unions, and therefore if you control the trade unions control the money and the members, and therefore there's only so much that someone can do against you. He also has almost complete control over the Parliamentary Labour Party, although there are some rebels. And again, that gives you pretty much most control over the party. He is also very good at one hand saying very vague socialist speeches, okay, which impress or reassure the average Labour ILP member that he is on their side, but at the same time being very vague, i.e. he'll talk about as if he is on the same mentality and the same vision of gradualist socialism as the ILP, but do nothing to actually promise that he'll do anything to go towards that. So he isn't promising anything, but people believe that he's on their side. If you can do that, that's a very, very skilled point, because naturally it means that people won't be annoyed at you because you're there quite clearly not breaking any promises. People's gut feeling is you're on their side, but they don't have anything to make you prove that, if that makes sense. So he is a very, very, very effective figure, and he is also the one key to focusing on the strategy, to focus on legitimizing the party as a trustworthy party of government first. He has long-term view in that regard, as opposed to short-term socialist speeches, etc. So, for example, he is quoted as saying, governments are not afraid of socialist speeches, they are afraid of criticism in detail, i.e. his job is not to simply waffle on socialist speeches, it is to be a very effective member of the opposition. So MacDonald's leadership essentially stops the organisation from dividing, secures the power and the relationship between the trade unions and the party apparatus, the party HQ, the central organisation, and as well as that, helps keep this image that Labour Party perhaps is a party that you can trust. And that's essential to get more votes. Without Ramsay MacDonald doing very vague social speeches, vague enough to keep his party happy, but at the same time not scaring the masses, that is, walking that fine line, that helps keep the party together, while at the same time showing that the party can be trusted, is not too radical. So again, that's focused on very incidental political decisions. More than that, though, you can say that the rise of Labour Party to some extent was inevitable and part of broader political and economic factors. You can argue that as the political changes of late 1800s, the 1884, 1867 Reform Acts, empower the working classes more and more, what we see in turn is naturally there will be increasing viability and demand for a left-wing party in the vein of Labour Party. Likewise, that naturally, as the working classes get more politically aware, as the rise of literacy, as the rise of organisation, as the rise of the size of the working classes, the increase in union membership, which spreads education, spreads messages, and spreads newspapers, as that happens, naturally the working classes, who are not massively well served by the Conservative Liberals, will begin to seek out another party. And you can just say, therefore, the Labour Party is just riding that wave of mass politics happening for the first time. And you can say what particularly helps beyond that is the fact that at the end of the 19th century there is a massive increase in economic hardship, which in turn leads to significant economic problems, which in turn leads to much more sympathy about the idea of politicising and having a far more left-wing political party to serve people's interest. People are happy with the status quo and therefore don't perhaps want brand new radical parties if things are going economically well. When things are going economically badly, that is when people start to consider maybe we should have a new party which represents what I truly want and need. So therefore, if we're going to summarise all the arguments that we've looked at, trade unions are absolutely key to giving numbers, the organisation, and the sort of whip to the herd of cats that is the Labour Party up until this point. There is the Lib Lab Pact and the actions of Ramsay MacDonald, which arguably is part of the Lib Lab Pact, are again absolutely essential in making the party and moving it towards a legitimate thing that people will vote for. And the longer term economics and the social changes also contributing to helping create an environment in which a working class party could actually exist. So that hopefully explains the factors which lead to the rise. We're now going to move on to the second question they could ask about this period, which is how successful were they? Now the sources will lead you to make the conclusion that it was not successful. Very often they use people from within the Labour Party itself to criticise the Labour Party, to trick those people who don't really understand the nature of the Labour Party to say, well, this must be true because it's a member of the Labour Party. Never forget that the Labour Party is not, and the LRC is not, one homogenous body. It's full of random people who all hate each other, who all disagree and who aren't part of an official party. So someone might be criticising Ramsay MacDonald, but they are just often an outsider and they don't necessarily show how successful they've actually been. So in reality, when we are judging how successful they are, you want to focus on what topics, what issues they are successful or unsuccessful at. Because in reality, Labour under Ramsay MacDonald and the trade unions are focused on doing only what the Ramsay MacDonald and the trade unionists wants. They do not want socialism, particularly at this early stage. What they want is twofold. Ramsay MacDonald wants the party to become increasingly more legitimised. Ramsay MacDonald does not care about what happens between 1906 and 1914. He cares about the fact that in 20 years' time the Labour Party will be the natural party of opposition as opposed to the Liberals. To do that, he needs to keep themselves separated from the Liberals. He needs to make sure that people see his parties are responsible and respectful and legitimate, not crazy socialist. And he needs to secure a nucleus of the party and get friends with the various unions and build up the party so it will be something strong in 20 years' time. The trade unions care most about trade union legislation. All the laws that have weakened the trade unions need to be reversed, and then they care about working conditions from there. They do not care about broader welfare or socialism that much. So if we have a look at what was changed, in reality, pretty much all the things which limited the power of the trade unions had been changed back. The Osborne judgment, the Taft-Vale decisions were both reversed. And so that suggests there was a success. But the problem we come up with is the problem of this whole question. What was that due to the Labour Party? The Labour Party was very small in Parliament. They didn't have much power. Did they force the Liberals to make this legislation, or did the Liberals do that in order to try and keep their party going? I.e., did the Liberals reverse the Taft-Vale's decision, the Osborne judgment, not because they were scared of Labour or they were told to by Labour, but because they in turn feared that if they didn't do that, the trade unions would only join more with Labour. So it wasn't because of Labour, it was because of themselves trying to make the left wing like them. You could, on top of that, instead, though, argue, okay, that might be true. The Liberals didn't listen to the Labour Party. They did it on their own back. But indirectly, because there was a Labour Party, the Liberals are now worried about keeping the unions happy, and that's why they did it. So indirectly, the Labour Party is helping do it. Likewise for social reform. The Labour Party is very important in helping vote through social reform, etc., etc. But as we've seen before, the amount of social reform isn't socialism. It's not a huge amount. And therefore, isn't that a failure? And a lot of the attacks on the Labour Party is saying they have not made the social reform any different to what the Liberals will do. Okay, and therefore you can say, well, actually, although their social reform happened, number one, it's not that great. Number two, the Liberals didn't really ask the Labour Party about it. They did it on their own back. Number three, the Liberals didn't even need the Labour Party's votes. Remember, the Liberals have a majority in the House of Parliament. Therefore, the Labour Party is pretty much pointless. They would have passed it without the Labour Party. The Labour Party didn't help. So it's unclear how much of a role the Labour Party actually had. So therefore, if you judge by results, it's very difficult to say the Labour Party did a lot, because the Liberals did most of the things. They don't seem to involve the Labour Party that much. You can, though, however, point out, shall we blame the Labour Party for this? They've only got 30-odd MPs. Can we expect them to have more of a role in this sort of stuff, considering they are not the party of government? Is it unreasonable, the sources, to say, why aren't they doing more socialism? How can they do more socialism if there's only 30 of them and there's 400-odd Labour MPs who don't need them? So when we look at this assessment, yes, in terms of, is the country close to socialism in 1914, the answer is no. It is arguably slightly more left-wing, but that's not because of what the Labour Party is doing. However, if you judge them by their Ramsay MacDonald's aims, the longer-term political stuff, the story is much better. The Labour Party has signed a Lib-Lab Pact. They've got people in government in 1906. In 1910, they increased the share of the votes and the seats, although there is a slight loss by 1914. The mining unions in 1909, who bring with them 90 seats, have now sided and joined the Labour Party. This is absolutely huge. The money, the support, and the parliamentary support. By the way, what we mean by that is the mining unions control all the miners in 90 seats. And so if the mining unions say we are voting for Labour, you are going to get hundreds and hundreds of people reliably voting for Labour. It's basically a machine politics situation, and therefore you get the seat there. So the mining unions is absolutely huge in terms of the amount of support you need. Okay. Likewise, there's a massive spike in the number of trade unions joining the Labour Party. So yes, there's not socialism now, but there is this long-term growth, strengthening of the party going on. And you can say, well, yes, unions would naturally join the Labour Party, but it's not inevitable the unions would join the Labour Party. They spent the last 70 years joining the Liberal Party. So they need to be proven that the Labour Party can be trusted, the Labour Party are better, and the Labour Party are doing what they promise. And the fact that Ramsay MacDonald is doing that means that these unions decide to leave the Liberal Party and join the Labour Party. And in the long term, that's incredibly important. So when we look at the success of Labour, we shouldn't really be focusing on the policies and how socialist they are, because that's a failure. We should say, well, the direct effects of the Labour Party are minimal, but in their defence, there's only 30 odd of them. So can we expect them to have a bigger effect? Considering the context, yeah, not great. But the indirect effect is much better. Remember, when we judge success, we don't just judge by what they do, we judge them by their context and their aims. Their context was they're a small party. We can't judge them for not getting much on. And considering they're a small party, they did a lot to strengthen and prove their legitimacy in that small period. Likewise, if you consider their aims, the aims of the socialists, SDF, who are gone, but the ILP and the Keir Hardys of the world, is to make socialism. So according to their aims, the party has failed. But they're not in charge of the party, so their aims don't matter. The people in charge of the party, Ramsay MacDonald, his aim is to make the party replace the Liberals. And he does that by step 1, making them a legitimate party, step 2, building up their base of support amongst unions. And he has done this to some extent. So in reality, it has been very successful, considering that it is a very, very hard line to walk for Ramsay MacDonald. He has to, on one side, be moderate enough so that the party looks relevant, okay, looks like it's not radical, looks like it can be trusted as a legitimate party of government. But on the other side, if it goes too moderate, then its own party will start causing problems, start rebelling, start causing all these issues. So walking a very fine line between being more radical than the Liberals to prove that you are different but also keep your party happy, but at the same time not going too far away so you look too radical and then you harm that image that you could be a responsible party. And that's the key success of the Labour Party. It is not achieving socialism, but we shouldn't expect them to achieve socialism, because look at the context and look at the aims. They couldn't possibly and don't want to. But if you look at simply what their aims were, they have created in 14 years the starting point of a proper party of opposition. And where it started in 1900, a herd of cats with Ramsay MacDonald as an unpaid leader of a party where most people feared and thought was a political joke, and it is now a viable political party with a mass base of support going into the next election after 1914 with a much stronger base, much stronger organisation, much more finances, much more members. That is arguably a success. So when you answer this question, always focus on the idea of what is the aim here. And just saying, and as the sources will try and trick you into saying, oh yeah, they did not do socialism, that's not showing the complexity, and that's not showing the understanding of the nature of the Labour Party. Okay, next hour, we are doing the suffragettes, and then we will cruise on with the last two of the pre-1945, which is industrial unrest and the Irish question. So until then, enjoy, and we will see you in the next video.